Okay, good evening, people. I'm just going to be talking a little bit while people are coming in. We're up to about 40 people. We had over 150 people RSVP for the event, which is very exciting because the Seekonk River means a lot to a lot of us. My name is Timmons Roberts. I'm a professor at Brown University in the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. I'm also somebody who runs, bikes, hikes, walks my dogs, and in the winter I cross-country ski around the bluffs over the Seekonk. And I started rowing at the boathouse, the NBC boathouse, 10 years ago, when I realized that I was on the shores really of a 5-mile long wonderful playground, and I just think it's a magical place. And seeing the river come back to life has meant a lot to me. And I know there's people who have been around a lot longer, including those from the boathouse who know this history very well. Our program is going to be that you've seen it in the announcements. Jamie Rivas is going to welcome everybody. Then Rick Richards is going to introduce Sue Kiernan from the Department of Environmental Management. She's going to give about a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have lots of times for questions and answers. I do want to mention the one bit of housekeeping, and that is that this is a webinar format on Zoom. So that means that you can send in questions by Q&A. We will try to reply to some of those directly. I'll collect up a bunch of those, ask those to Sue after her talk. And then there's another thing, once we get into the Q&A time, then if you have a question that would be much better to do verbally, we're gonna try and open up a few after we've done some of the big questions that sort of combine a lot of other people's comments. So I think I'll hand it over, first of all, to Jamie Rivas, the volunteer president of the Narragansett Boat Club. Jamie?
Thanks, Timmons. Good morning, everybody. Or good evening. I'm Jamie Revis. I'm the president of the Narragansett Boat Club, and I'd like to welcome you to what should be an interesting and hopefully very positive evening. The sponsors of tonight's event are the Narragansett Boat Club, the Blackstone Parks Conservancy, the Fox Point Neighborhood Association, Friends of India Point Park, the Institute at Brown for Environmental and Society, the Providence Stormwater Innovation Center, Save the Bay, and the Seekonk River Revitalization Alliance. Some of these organizations are relative newcomers, while others are well-established institutions, including the Boat Club, which, for those who aren't familiar with us, is the oldest rowing club in the country, having been on the Seekonk River since 1838. But what all the sponsors have in common is that each is and has been intimately involved with the recovery and health of the Seekonk River. Having rowed on the river for over 30 years now, I can attest to their efforts. What was practically a dead river, it almost glowed in the dark back in the day, it is now teeming with life. Earlier this summer, a bald eagle flew less than 10 feet off the stern of my single with a fish in its talons. Watching it fly across the river and up into the trees on the Providence shore is a sight I will not soon forget, nor is one I could have imagined witnessing 30 years ago. Before we begin, I would like to thank a few volunteers without whom this presentation would not have happened. Timmons Roberts, who you've already met, for arranging the speaker and other details. Timmons will also serve as our moderator, and after last night, we decided to equip him with both a mute button and a cattle prod, so please behave. Jeff Williams, for making this a truly neighborhood event by publicizing around the east side. Rick Richards, for coordinating with all the neighborhood groups. Rick has also spearheaded a number of studies about and around the river. Maura Flanagan, who handled all the flyers and advertising, and Kim Worrell, who put together the electronic invitations. I would now like to introduce the aforementioned Rick Richards, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here. This is a great occasion. And I can think of no one better qualified to talk about the Seekonk River than Sue Kiernan. Expertise is established over time, and our speaker has built her expertise over nearly 40 years. First at Save the Bay, and since 1987 at the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. During this time, Sue's professional focus has been on developing and implementing policies that protect and improve Rhode Island's water resources, our groundwater, surface water, and wetlands. Sue works hard to improve our groundwater by developing programs that mitigate non-point source pollution and monitor water quality. She is currently responsible for Rhode Island's non-point source pollution management program. She also administers the Narragansett Bay and Watershed Restoration Fund, which has awarded over $18 million in grants for a variety of stormwater, water quality improvement, habitat restoration, and aquatic invasive species management projects. We are fortunate tonight to have access to Sue's substantial knowledge about Rhode Island's water resources, what ails them, and how to cure them. I am eager to hear what she has to say about the Seekonk River and hope it helps us find ways to restore it to full health.
Okay. Rick, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I also want to thank Timmins for the invitation to speak to this group tonight. You have the Narragansett Boat Club, you've got a tremendous group of sponsors that I won't repeat, but I'm really appreciative of all the energy and interest that they bring to the river and to the interest in improving the river. I'm going to start with a little look back on the history. The Seekonk River and the Providence River that it flows into, as well as the Blackstone that flows into it, they've all been heavily impacted by humans over the course of history. We're in the place that's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution for this country. That spurred alteration of our river systems by the construction of dams, over 500 of them in the 1800s, virtually on every flowing stream in Rhode Island. We altered historically wetlands across this area. Downtown Providence used to be wetland and is no longer. We've estimated statewide that we filled about 53% of our salt marshes. And we used our waterways historically as really the dumping ground for wastes. The US Geological Survey kind of summed it up well with this statement from one of their studies that the damming of the rivers and the historical disposal of wastes made some of the coastal rivers in New England among the most contaminated in the nation in the 20th century. There was early recognition of the problems. In 1895, the oyster beds off of Fields Point were closed, and there had been prior outbreaks of disease and closure issues occurring way back then. We began to build our wastewater infrastructure in 1897, first in Woonsocket and then followed over in Providence in 1901. There were studies in the early 1900s documenting that over 260 pipes, once we built collection systems for wastewater, were dumping raw sewage into the Upper Bay area. And in 1946, the Health Department's Division of Sanitary Engineering documented that the pollution of the bay now extended further than it ever had before. The map on the right is actually from 1954, and you can see that the Seekonk and Providence River are highlighted in red, which puts it in a category of very impacted waters. So as we continued, fortunately, there's response. In 1954, the Buckland Point wastewater plant was constructed that discharges to the Seekonk. In 1970, Save the Bay was organized, and I want to wish them a happy 50th birthday. It's a tremendous organization that's done tremendous work. In 1972, what's really laid the groundwork for a lot of the progress were amendments to federal statutes that have been known as the Clean Water Act. It spurred investment in wastewater treatment that was really beneficial to the waters of Rhode Island and of course across the country. The graph on the right shows what that investment some of what that investment brought us over time. It's showing the number of treatment plants. We actually had 5 new plants built in the 80s. It shows how we evolved from doing primary treatment, which is primarily a settling process, to the orange bars reflecting biological treatment, secondary treatment, over to the green bars, which represent advanced treatment. And today we now estimate about 80% of the design flow is flowing through wastewater facilities that have advanced treatment. In the 1980s, we instituted industrial pretreatment to control toxics. We moved to water quality-based permits instead of technology-based permits, and that helped drive reducing nutrient pollutant loads. We've had a program to abate combined sewer overflows, and more recently, in the last 15, 20 years, stormwater management as part of Clean Water Act implementation. So how do we evaluate water quality and how it's doing? DEM is delegated under the Clean Water Act to do this. We have a framework for assessing water. Our waters are across the state are divided up into units. The Seekonk River is a single assessment unit. The Providence River is broken into 2 units. There are water quality standards established that consist of 2 things. One is the designated uses for the water body, which include things like recreation and wildlife habitat. And then the criteria that we use to evaluate whether those uses are being met. The department goes through a process to collect all the data it can, including its own data, but also from outside parties. We compare that data to the criteria in our regulations. We determine whether a water body is meeting its use or not. If it's not meeting its use, it's called impaired, and it goes on a list of impaired waters. Once it's on that list, if it's impaired by a pollutant, it may be subject to something called a TMDL development process, which is really the development of a water quality restoration plan. But there also are other actions that are taken, such as permitting actions, to try to advance restoration of water quality. There's actually going to be a public hearing next week on October 6th at 3 o'clock on Zoom about the latest impaired waters list. And if people are interested in that, I can provide some details. Big picture statewide, we know we still have continuing problems. This is from our last assessment that was approved by EPA from 2016. 51% of the river miles in the state have 1 or more impairments. 36% of the coastal waters have 1 or more impairments, with low dissolved oxygen and pathogens being the most prevalent, and 30% of lakes have 1 or more impairment. So here's where we are for the coming assessment, which is in development and will be submitted to EPA later this year. The Seekonk River is not supporting its uses for recreation, for fish and wildlife habitat, and relative to fish consumption, we simply don't have enough information to make a judgment. These are the same impairments that have been listed for quite some time, and so you can see on the right when they were first listed on the list. So we've had problems for decades, and we've known about those. So let's go a little deeper into the water quality data, because the story is one of improvement. Relative to toxics, industrial pretreatment was really effective at reducing the level of toxics that were discharged into our coastal waters from treatment plants. This is from the Buckland Point treatment plant on the Seekonk, and it goes from 94 to 2019, and it just shows the reduction in the amount of metals coming into the treatment facility, and also the reduction of what the treatment facility let out. In 2004, there was questions about whether there were metal impairments in the water column in the Providence River. And based on data that was available, DEM was able to make a determination that there were no impairments for the metals listed there, and they were delisted from the list. So we don't currently have any metal impairments in the water column of either the Seekonk or Providence River. We do, though, have metals in the sediments. And there is a strong north to south pollution gradient that occurs in Narragansett Bay. And this is not just for metals, but for many types of pollutants. And the Seekonk, unfortunately, at that headwaters and in such close proximity to where so much was discharged historically and continues to be discharged, it's a stressed system. So
Now, can you point out where the Seekonk is on the map on the left?
Sure.
Yeah, there, folks.
So here's the Seekonk up here. Sorry, I probably should have oriented everyone. And then this is the Providence River, which then flows into Narragansett Bay. And so this is work from Brown University looking at metal concentrations in the surface sediments. And again, they're higher concentrations as you go north, and then down in this area, the sediments are much healthier. However, if you look at the cores, this figure over here, these are sediment cores from researchers. This is work reported in the Narragansett Bay Status and Trends Report. These reflect really the industrial history of Rhode Island, going back to the 1700s, where there were fairly low levels, spiking after the Industrial Revolution took off with much higher concentrations, and then coming back after Clean Water Act implementation to much lower levels. So we're on a positive trend, and in some cases, it looks like the surface sediments, at least, are below these red lines, which represent thresholds of ecological effect. So that's a positive trend. Another expression of what's going on in the benthic environment is work that's been done by researchers to evaluate what's living on the bottom of our estuaries, including the Seekonk. So this is work that was done over 30 years. They repeated the same survey. They use a sediment imaging camera that slides into the sediments, takes a picture, and then allows somebody to interpret what's living there, whether it be worms, invertebrates, or clams, or other kinds of creatures. And the biological community is then really a good indicator of the health of the bottom of the sediments. And what's happened over time in this graph, this map, is that we're seeing improvement in the middle of the bay. There's more blue and green stations here compared to previous surveys, but we're still stressed up in the Providence and Seekonk rivers, as well as over in the Greenwich Bay area, which also exhibits other stressors as well. Just touch briefly on mercury in fish tissue. This is a data gap. There has been research documenting that fish in the bay do have some levels of mercury contamination. The department really needs to do a little more work to assess that information and determine how that fits into to our standards of assessment process. Right now, we consider the bay unassessed for the fish consumption use. In the meantime, the health department, which wants to promote fish as a healthy part of a healthy diet and the benefits that you get from consuming fish, they've got guidance at their website about which species should be avoided and how which people might be more sensitive to the consumption of fish. So you can go there for more information. Just quickly around nutrients, another major water quality concern in Rhode Island. Why do we care about nutrients? Nitrogen is the nutrient of concern in our coastal waters in the Seekonk. Too many nutrients drive the production of algae and phytoplankton blooms can happen very rapidly. And then when they run out of food, they die. That material can sink to the bottom where it decomposes. And in that process, it's taking oxygen out of the water column, leading to very low levels and sometimes no level of oxygen, dissolved oxygen in the water. That's obviously bad for the life that lives there, including fish, and we have had experience of fish kills in the past. So this has been a focus of management. We track this problem with monitoring the bay. This is just a little bit about that process, the system. We have 13 to 14 stations deployed. There's a station in the Seekonk at Phillipsdale that's operated by the Narragansett Bay Commission. This map again up here, here's Phillipsdale. The colors here show is some representation of the degree of hypoxia that's been occurring, and hypoxia being low oxygen conditions. The Seekonk, once again with Greenwich Bay, have historically been and will continue to be the places that have the most prevalence of low oxygen conditions, and those haven't been fully abated. So that's the conditions there. What was done to try to combat this was a strategy with the treatment plant, wastewater treatment plants, which were the largest load of nutrients to the system. 11 wastewater treatment plants were targeted in Rhode Island, along with 6 that are upstream in Massachusetts. The goal was set to reduce nutrient loadings by 50% over the 1995-96 levels, at least seasonally from May to October when the system is most sensitive. That goal has been achieved around the 2012-2013 timeframe. We've got a reduction of 64%. And that's a real victory after the investment in those wastewater upgrades. And we're continuing to monitor to see how the system responds. This graph shows a little bit about that. This is an interpretation from a researcher who has developed an index that takes into account the frequency, the duration, and the severity of hypoxic events. And it just reinforces what I indicated on the map, that the Providence Phillipsdale station, which is in pink here, and the Greenwich Bay station, which are in black, they're running at a much higher rate of recording hypoxia than the other stations lower in the bay. And you'll see that it jumps around quite a bit. There's a lot of inter-annum variability, and that's attributed to the influence of precipitation and river flows, among other factors. So we've reduced nutrients, but have we completely eliminated fish kills? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. These are the recorded fish kill events from records from our Division of Marine Fisheries, which goes out and investigates fish kills. So if you see an event, you can certainly report it to DEM, and we have a response program. There have been some reports from 18 and 19. And I don't have the information for 20 this summer, but most of them involve Atlantic menhaden. And sometimes there's a predator issue where the predator has chased fish into a certain area, but all of these have been associated by DEM with low oxygen conditions as well. And hopefully we are on a pathway to keeping these to minor or moderate events and not having large-scale fish kills that have occurred more in the past. So after all of that, how about some good news? Upstream of the Seekonk is the Blackstone River, also very altered and polluted over the years. But the efforts up there to reduce nutrients have actually resulted in a situation where the department is now proposing to delist the Blackstone River as impaired for dissolved oxygen and total phosphorus, which is the nutrient of concern in freshwater systems. This is attributed to the treatment plant upgrades, and we're optimistic EPA will approve this, and looking forward to having that good news be spread. So let's switch to pathogens. I know this is a topic of real interest. In the Seekonk River, there's no licensed beaches. So in our coastal systems, the health department does monitor beaches, but they're not regularly monitoring the Seekonk because there's no beach. They have had a project for urban beaches, so there's some data being collected there. And then there are additional programs, and a program that's been run by the Narragansett Bay Commission that provides some data. So this map is of stations that the Narragansett Bay Commission samples from for pathogens in the Seekonk. Under our regulations, we use 2 pathogen indicators. We have fecal coliform indicators. The number there is 200, and there's some more details to that in the way it's applied. And enterococci, just another pathogen indicator. The number there to pay attention to is 35 colonies. And that's what's used to assess swimming and recreational use in the Seekonk. So here's where we are. You know from the prior slide that we are not characterizing the use as being supported in the Seekonk, but I do think there is indications of a positive trend. You've got a downward trend line. These are the annual geo-means of the fecal coliform concentrations collected from the Seekonk over time. And what we're actually seeing in these low dips here is that that particular time period would have qualified as supporting the recreational use. But because of this variability and the inconsistency, we're not in a position to suggest that it's been fully restored. And honestly, I don't think that we'll be in a position to do that until we get the CSO CSO abatement program further implemented. But I think you can take some satisfaction in knowing that there are days where things look okay out there. Again, wet weather's having an influence. So advice from the state is to continue to take precautions when you're recreating on the Seekonk. Wash after you've been in contact with the water, and if you do get dunked in the river, try not to ingest that water. Urban Beach Initiative from the Health Department provides another look at this and another signal of improvement. So there are 4 locations that have been monitored. They've been doing some of this work in collaboration with Save the Bay. And what they've determined from an analysis of their information over time, and these are different time periods that were grouped, 2011 ranging up to 2018, they've determined that the water quality around Fields Point and Bowles Point actually has approached a condition that's similar to the water quality around swimming areas that are licensed and opened down in Barrington, Bristol, and Warren. So that really shows improvement. This is their threshold line of 30 for their particular criteria in the units they're using for enterococcus bacteria. And you can see at Bold Point an improvement line. You can see at Rosa Larissa an improvement. Now over at Sabin Point, there are some other things going on with stormwater, and that situation isn't quite as rosy a picture. And we'll talk about that in a second. So CSOs, this is something of concern to should be something of concern to the Seekonk River advocates. This is a map of where CSOs historically were before there was any abatement, and you can see that upstream of you in the Seekonk, along Pawtucket and Central Falls, there's a number of places where CSOs discharge. This is the focus of phase 3 of the CSO abatement plan. The overall goal of the plan is to get down to less than 4 overflows a year and to reduce by 80% the shellfish closures in the Upper Bay. The program had 3 phases, and I presume many people know about this. The first phase was completed in 2008, involved a significant tunnel built under Providence. The second phase was completed in 2014 that further reduced 17 CSOs more on the western side of the city. Collectively, and the phase 2 also directed water into the tunnel, storage tunnel. And so I neglected to mention what a CSO is, but it's a place where there's a combination of sanitary wastewater and stormwater or other waters that combine together. And in the case of overflows, they're in a system where they're going to overflow when it rains. And it's an EPA requirement to abate that. So the storage tunnel functions to hold the water until it can be directed into the treatment plant at Fields Point and treated before it's released. And they've been annually doing that to over 1 billion gallons of water a year since they went operational on phase 1 and 2. That translated into real improvements. This is a map of shellfishing areas in the Upper Bay. So this is, the Seekonk is further up here, but this is the Providence River area. What happened after assessing the results from post phase 1 and 2 is that this area down here, which had been conditionally closed for 70 years, which meant after certain rainstorms, it automatically closed. This was reclassified to an approved shellfishing area, meaning it's open routinely. And this area in orange, the rainfall trigger, this is still managed as a conditional area. That rainfall trigger was raised to 1.2 inches from previously lower values. And what that's reflecting is that smaller rainstorms are not able to create enough of a problem with water quality that we need to close the shellfishing in this area. So it's totally increased the number of days that people are able to work in that area. And we're continuing to track whether further improvements and adjustments can be made to that. So phase 3, this is what's coming. It's currently in a design phase, and the Narragansett Bay Commission has submitted a number of preliminary design plans, and they're working towards final design in some cases. It will be another tunnel running through Pawtucket and collecting combined wastewaters and directing them to the Buckland Point treatment plant. 3, it's been broken into 4 phases. The first phase involving the tunnel, it's expected to be completed by 2028 and possibly, and maybe even probably somewhat earlier based on recent activity. The remaining schedule of the phases, because there's a lot of a reevaluation that goes along the way in this sort of adaptive approach, the remaining schedule stretches out probably out into the early 2040s. And another important point to make is that NBC is committed to spending $10 million on green infrastructure investment in each phase as part of abating CSOs. And in some cases, that's separating the stormwater from the sanitary wastewater so that it's not contributing to the CSO problem and doing other things with it. So stormwater is also a major source of pathogens, not just in the Seekonk, but statewide. And this aerial shot of the watershed, sub-watershed for the Seekonk really shows how developed it is. Has historically been somewhat of a rule of thumb that a watershed that has more than 10% impervious cover is probably going to begin to see adverse impacts in the aquatic ecosystem. This has been, the Seekonk's been estimated at 56% impervious cover. So we are certainly challenged in this area to work with this landscape and try to mitigate the impacts that it's historically had. Much of this was developed without any sense of modern stormwater standards for handling stormwater runoff, other than to direct it as soon as possible away from a site to avoid flooding. We do have now in the state of Rhode Island, and have had since 2010, actual water quality-based stormwater standards in the design manual for new construction that's also applied to reconstruction. So we're preventing, I think, the problem from getting worse, and those new standards emphasize infiltration and trying to mimic the way nature would handle stormwater. But we still have a lot of retrofitting that we're going to need to do to manage this source of pollution.
And Sue, just to make sure people know the term impervious surface, that means paved areas, rooftops, anything that the water can't absorb into.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Clarification, sure. So we really need a lot more of this green infrastructure. And what does that mean? It's really practices that are mimicking the way and taking advantage of natural systems and mimicking the way nature would handle things. We need to keep water that's draining off land, ideally in the watershed that it originated in. We need to infiltrate more. We need to take advantage of vegetative systems. And a lot of these green practices really deliver a lot of co-benefits, not just in terms of managing the stormwater, but in terms of the health and conditions in a city, in particular, addressing issues like heat islands and just the livability and air quality and just all sorts of other benefits. So I highlighted there's a number of partners, and some of them were sponsors of this event tonight. I wanted to highlight the Providence Stormwater Innovation Center, which has come into, been established relatively recently. It's centered at Roger Williams Park in Providence. And it's a great place to go because they've installed a number of practices that you can go physically look at, maybe get inspired by. They're going to be sponsoring training and outreach, and they're a potential great resource for anyone interested in green infrastructure. There's a Green Infrastructure Coalition, which is also out there partnering on these things. And another great resource, even their website provides examples of what's been done elsewhere. A lot of times, I think people need to get inspired by seeing the actual sites. EPA has their Soak Up the Rain initiative, which has a series of webinars that explain a lot about green infrastructure and that have highlighted a couple sites from Rhode Island, including the Bristoltown Beach facility, which was completely renovated with green infrastructure. And then SNEP stands for the Southeast New England Program. They've established recently a technical assistance network. So there's resources out there focused around this issue. Projects can range from rain gardens, which can be done by volunteer groups and can be done at your own home, to bigger engineered systems that really are typically done more by governmental entities, DOT, or large development projects. So there's a whole range of practices, but there's great resources out there to learn more about them. So just a couple of quick examples of green infrastructure in action. Save the Bay and the City of East Providence have been focusing for several years on Sabin Point. The goal is to bring back a viable beach in this area. Having stormwater empty onto the beach like this is not helpful. So they're looking up gradient in the watershed and finding opportunities to infiltrate and apply green infrastructure and use different practices. And a series of grants have helped support them make progress on that, and that work is continuing. And then this is an example of a green, they call it green stormwater infrastructure project that MDC is in partnership with the City of Central Falls. So here you are in a very heavily urbanized area. MDC needed places to try to have space to infiltrate stormwater, get it out of the CSO system. City of Central Falls had an athletic facility that was in need of renovation, and they came together, and the result is a large infiltration practice that's underneath the fields and a renovated athletic facility. And there's other, I should say, there's other little bioswales and other stormwater practices at this site. But it's led to renovation of fields that provide a much better facility for the City of Central Falls, and it's a win-win for both sides. So let's turn back just a little bit to habitat. With water quality having improved over the years, habitat is really become of greater interest. And our Marine Fisheries Division has been working with the Nature Conservancy on a study of specifically the Providence and Seekonk rivers. So these are stations in the map of where they've been collecting information about fisheries. And their goal is to identify opportunities to improve habitat and foster even more productive fisheries in this area. And this isn't something they would have done years ago when the water quality conditions were so poor, but this has been happening. I don't know if the recreational users of the river have seen the officials out there doing this work, but they've been busy for several years. What's in the middle picture is a seine survey. This is done from the shore, and they're going to capture particularly lots of small fish in that technique. And then the graph over here just indicates there's a lot of species living in the Seekonk River. You've got, in 2019, I tallied it up, and it was over 20 species of different fish that had been caught through these seine surveys on the stations that are in the Seekonk River. So what do they look like? This is what they look like, some of them. A few of these species were caught in the Providence River, but many of them are from the Seekonk. And you can see there's lots of juvenile fish. So the Marine Fisheries Division is really interested in trying to foster conditions that are going to allow those juvenile fish to thrive. So we have blue sea bass, flounder, tautog, and interesting things like the pufferfish and scup. Anyway, lots of interesting things showing up there. So an example of habitat enhancement, this is again a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and the DEM Marine Fisheries Division, was the installation of reef balls in the north of Sabin Point. There were 64 of these cement structures that have holes in them, and they were rated in 4 clusters. And the goal is to create habitat for juvenile and adult sport fish, particularly tautog, black sea bass, and scup. And so these were installed in October of 2019. And then this picture down here is from one of the dives that took place over this summer. So this is a new technique. This hadn't been done before in Rhode Island, and it's being tried out, and they're doing scuba dives to evaluate what's happening with that habitat. And this year they have reported there's more diverse algae growth around those reef balls, and they, in one case, had seen 50 juvenile tautog hanging out by one of those. So it's still early, and it's going to take more time to know whether this is a highly effective approach, but it's a project that's interesting, kind of exciting project that got promoted. Another restoration effort that DEM is involved in is the restoration of fish passage to the lower Blackstone River. All those dams that were built blocked historic fish runs that occurred through the Seekonk into the Blackstone River. The objective of the project is to get fish passage over the lower 4 dams on the Blackstone which would take fish up to the Lonsdale Marsh area where there's a significant amount of potential spawning and nursery habitat. It's projected that it might support runs of 200,000 herring and close to 10,000 shad. I think it would be really exciting to be able to restore those runs, but this is a very complex project. There's hydropower involved on some of those dams, and it's going to take more money than is currently available in order to implement the entire project, but it is actively being worked on by a large coalition of partners, including Army Corps, NRCS, Nature Conservancy, and the Blackstone Watershed Council, Friends of the Blackstone. And then just to touch on a couple more topics. Plastics. This has emerged as a bigger issue in Rhode Island in the last few years. Governor Raimondo created a task force that came out with a report. The philosophy behind that report is recommended that we be pursuing eliminating the single-use plastics and other plastic products in favor of reusable ones. And where we can't do that, that we make better use of recyclable plastics, and where that's not feasible, we got to find better ways to ensure that we're collecting and disposing of plastics properly so they do not end up on our beaches and in our waterways. The statistics around plastics are pretty scary in terms of the amount that is now currently in our oceans and waters, and we know from our beach cleanups how much is deposited up on the shores each year. So some of the initiatives that have been out there, DEM is coordinating a zero plastics initiative with marinas. We're introducing more sensitivity around single-use plastics in the Hospitality Green Certification Program that works with restaurants and hotels. We know the coastal and Earth Day cleanups that go on around the state, Save the Bay, Clean Ocean Access, and other groups that have been historically involved in this, lots of neighborhood groups doing cleanups. That's essential work to helping curb the effects of this. And then in 2020, there were 3 pieces of legislation the department supported that would have curbed the use of single-use plastic bags, plastic straws, and the mass release of balloons. Those bills did not pass. Of course, we have been hit by COVID. We do anticipate those will likely, some legislation will probably be, this will be the subject of legislation again in 2021. EPA has a trash-free waters initiative, and there's just lots of outreach and other activities fostering awareness around this so that we put less plastic into our waterways. Climate change, just have to talk about climate change. There's no question that we're dealing with this. This affects all the programs that the Office of Water is involved with at DEM. These are slides from the status and trends report of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. Bay temperatures have definitely been on a rising trend, and sea level rise. This upper graph is from the tide gauge in the Providence River, showing 6.6 inches over that period of time. It's going to affect really almost every program we implement in terms of both human impacts as well as ecological impacts and understanding those. And it raises questions about the water pollution control strategies that we've put in place and how those will be affected as ambient conditions in our waterways change. We have seen more days over 80 degrees in the bay as an average temperature than we have in the past. And that does have implications for, the viability of different marine species that have preferences for certain temperature ranges for their reproduction and survival. One of the things that we did in response to growing awareness about climate change was a statewide assessment of wastewater infrastructure. It was completed in 2017. This is where Buckland Point's facility extends into the Seekonk River, and you can see that it's surrounded by a berm. That berm was raised a bit, and I just want to convey that all of the treatment facilities now have incorporated, there are requirements that they're addressing resiliency as they go forward. So Buckland, as part of phase 3 CSO abatement, will be making changes to their facility, and there'll be construction, and And as they're doing that, we now, there's dialogue that happens about, well, let's take into account what could happen with sea level rise. This berm will be effective for a certain period of time, and I'm not going to try to speculate how long, but eventually, you know, that's going to have to be looked at pretty carefully. And then the state hasn't started to invest in adaptation for these facilities. One of the points about wastewater facilities is they're in the lowest point of the watershed. They take advantage of gravity through much of their sewer distribution systems. And so they're all vulnerable to what's happening due to climate, whether it's flooding or sea level rise if they're located near the coast. So some of the grants that have been given out in the past year were to let them do short-term things like getting key components raised up to second floors of buildings and protecting electrical components and just various different things like that. So to wrap up, we believe, and it's reflected in our state guide plan for clean water, that clean water is a shared responsibility. So I was asked to just share some thoughts about what can you do? And these are just a few ideas, and there certainly would be many more, but planting trees from a climate change perspective, that's a very good thing to do. There's guidance out there about how you can adopt practices at home that are bay friendly. There's a Save the Bay guide, or information from DEM on things you can do related to fertilizer and other practices you have at home. The volunteer cleanups are very important, supporting the NGOs working in your watershed, and what a great collection of organizations we have on the call tonight. Participating in the Municipal Resiliency Planning Program. This is coordinated by the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and for 2020, I believe Providence, Central Falls, and Pawtucket were all participating. So people really interested in climate change adaptation strategies can engage there. Anything that we can do to protect, enhance, or replant riparian buffers is going to be beneficial. The existing natural buffer that's left along the Seekonk, really trying to ensure that that stays intact and that we find ways to maybe expand on that. If there's a stretch of pavement somewhere that's really not necessary anymore for whatever reason, removing those and planting instead, enhancing the buffer and trying to keep invasives out. Those are all very positive actions. And then just advocating for needed projects, whether they're big or small, and in all likelihood, advocating for the funding to be able to make them happen. And I want to just end with the department, as part of its own strategic plans, totally believes in building partnerships. So we are actively working with groups like the Green Infrastructure Coalition and the Rhode Island Rivers Council, and DEM has strong partnerships with the Nature Conservancy, the universities, and we work quite closely with the Narragansett Bay Commission on their wastewater infrastructure. It's the only way we're going to get all this work done, and it's what we need to do. We are excited that there's growing recreational use in the urban waters that surround Providence, including in the Seekonk. And so all of us working together, we really hope we can sustain some momentum and keep what I hope are improving trends on track to take us to an even healthier river system. And with that, I'll stop. I might have gone a little long.
That was fabulous. Nobody can clap but those of us who are the empowered ones up here. But I want to say that was a tour de force, just a ton of information, and answered a lot of the questions, just that huge list of questions that we threw at you when we asked you to give this talk. So thank you. I know that was a lot of work pulling that together. And so we need to thank Department of Environmental Management for your time, and for Dr. Director Coit for connecting us to you. So that was fabulous. I also want to thank the Narragansett Boat Club for pitching in, actually for sponsoring the web hosting and the media services support from Brown University. So thank you to the media services people. We have Lewis and Sapphire on here with us, helping us out, holding our hands, and navigating these particular waters of the Zoom. We have some questions that have come in. I think I do want to make sure we talk about partnerships and working together. That's, one of our secret agendas with this event is that maybe some new momentum um, will develop around addressing some of the key issues for the Seekonk going forward. But you have given us a lot of hope and really shown how much difference all the work so far has made. So let me just get to one of the questions that everybody asks when I tell people that we're doing this talk. They want to know about swimming. And you answered a lot, but there was still some lingering questions, I think, in people's minds. For example, you showed us that, in fact, all that sampling through 2016 and 2017 was at Crook Point. And Crook Point, for people who don't know, is the big railroad bridge that sticks straight up in the air. So the old abandoned railroad bridge. I think we're back a couple more, several more. There. Yeah, Crook Point is that's all the way from 2007, really through 2017, was well below the fecal coliform levels, which were dropping. That's just the average dropping over that time? Or is that?
These are annual geo-means. So yeah, that's an average value that's dropping over time.
What's the safe level considered on fecal coliforms? Did you know?
For us, it's 200, measured as most probable number per 100 milliliters.
Yeah, so it looks like it's doing okay and a lot of that. But a lot of it has to do with the wet and dry periods. So for example, I noticed this spring that the red flag was out almost every day at the Buckland Point sewage treatment plant in the middle of the Seekonk. And if you look at the Phillipsdale landing, for those who don't know, that's where the old steel mill was, the red mill, on the East Providence side, north of what, and on the east side of Providence, sort of across from Butler and the Swan Point Cemetery. That those are significantly worse, and there was those big spikes, for example, in 2018 in emissions, right, from the sewage plant. So that the sewage plant appears to be still a problem, right? And when I asked some people from the Narragansett Bay Commission who were out sampling, they said, well, we put the flag up because it's going to rain. So then I wanted to see if you would turn back to the slide where you have the dry and wet periods, because that's kind of the question to me. I mean, I saw people in a motorboat anchoring off of the river road on the east side there, and
Yeah.
swimming off their motorboat this summer. But it was so dry this summer, so I'm wondering if it's during the dry periods, is the water significantly safer, right? The big problem is when there's a big storm and it washes all the pet waste off of the urban areas, and then also, sewage might get into the sewer systems, into the outflows.
I would say yes, that we generally, and the health department has also generally correlated, wet weather washes more things into the waterways. Both from you still have your upstream CSO issues in the Blackstone, and you've got lots of ways that stormwater is still getting into the river. So I think those are really the major sources, and the treatment facility, which is doing disinfection, really shouldn't be, but occasionally they may have breakdowns or overflows, but their performance, both the Fields Point plant and Buckland, have been performing in compliance pretty well with their permits. I can mention that it's part of their new permit that they're working on a notification system, and there's been a pilot project. So the NBC is actually installing and creating instrumentation where they'll get more automatic reporting about CSOs and releases. and try to automate more of that and then have that somehow be publicly shared. And so that system isn't fully figured out yet. And I think there's a lot of electronics to it that have to be worked out, but that's being actively worked on, and it's part of their permit requirement to do that. So there will be news coming from that. So some better system of public notification should be forthcoming.
Great. Here's a question from David Mandelbaum. Do you have specific suggestions for bay-friendly practices at home? So, how much fertilizer is okay for yards? How much, are pesticides also running off and making a problem? What about leaving, more debris on the ground? Does that help slow runoff and things like that?
So they fall into categories such, so let's just take lawn maintenance first. So, perhaps minimizing where you're going to have your typical lawn because you're going to want to apply the fertilizers and pesticides. But how you use fertilizers and pesticides, there's been changes in the formulations of fertilizer that have helped reduce some nutrients going into our waterways. But being really cognizant of how much you fertilize, particularly relative to rainstorms, limiting use of pesticides, finding safer alternatives, having buffers. If your property is very close to a waterway, having vegetated buffers between your maintained lawn and the actual waterway is really important. Composting and recycling clippings into your lawn is a good practice. And then things, household hazardous waste issues like changing motor oil for your car, or even washing your car. You can do those in ways where the water's not running off into the street. Obviously, oil shouldn't be. There's proper ways to dispose of oil. Making sure hazardous household waste isn't disposed of improperly. Proper maintenance of septic systems if you happen to be in that area, but in the Seekonk area, we're pretty much all sewered. Those are just some of the things. I'm sure the Bay Friendly Living Guide has even more. And shading is actually important for protecting water quality on freshwater streams that are tributary.
Thank you. And Sam Corin asks, how invasive plants impact the urban watershed?
So this is partly an interesting topic of research. So let's start with Phragmites, which you see along coastal areas and sometimes just takes over. So on one hand, Phragmites is a problem. It creates these monolithic, very dense stands that make it difficult for anything else to survive there. It's a very rigorous plant. It's difficult to control. And so there's a lot of attempts to try to mitigate, Phragmites spreading through systems where we want a more balanced vegetation. So there's places along the urban corridor where that occurs. However, there's also researchers that are looking at the fact that Phragmites is a pretty hardy plant. It takes up a fair amount of nutrients. And I believe EPA is sponsoring some research on looking at whether harvesting Phragmites might be actually adapted as a management strategy in some locations as a way of extracting nutrients from an affected water body. So there's some really interesting work going on out there around that plant. Other invasives in the watershed, there's just various plants that there's general concern about trying to control them. I am not as familiar with all of the work being done on marine invasives. There are surveys that track what marine invasive species are coming into Narragansett Bay, and our Marine Fisheries Division is frequently picking up visitors from southern waters that have made their way up here. But I'm not and it's such an open system, so open ecosystem, it's much more difficult to imagine trying to manage that. There is a lot of vigilance done relative to, I think it's green crabs. and there might be management that could be effective there. But I'm not aware that invasive has disrupted the ecology of the bay at this point in time.
Thanks. So I'm going to roll together three questions. They're all about fish. So one question is sort of, what were the source of the pollutants, especially the metals in the river that appear to be still a problem for the fish, and sewage, the problem for swimming? So what are the main sources for those?
So the metals really reflect the industrial past. They might have been energy facilities in the past, but also we went through a period where jewelry making was a significant industry in this state. And certainly going back historically, Gorham Silver and some of the major names, that was a strength of Rhode Island at the time. And so there was just a lot of discharge from those manufacturing, silversmith and metalworking operations. There was a point in time where there were hundreds of smaller operations in the Providence metropolitan region supporting the jewelry making industry. Now, part of what happened with industrial pretreatment along the same lines is that the economy changed and some of that manufacturing went overseas. And so there's a much smaller number of firms engaged in that, to my knowledge, and certainly the volume of wastewater generated is less. But it's really industrial activities in terms of some of those heavier metals. And then just road runoff also contributes more diffuse contributions of metals, particularly lead.
Right.
And the phase out of leaded gasoline has been tracked as an improving trend. But in the past, a lot of lead came from combustion.
Apparently there's even like heavy metals that come off of tires and other car parts, right?
Cars, yeah.
And engine stuff. So there was another question about, who's communicating with all these, it's wonderful to see the amount of people fishing along the riverbank now, families picnicking and so on, but are they being told about the dangers of the fish? And it is mostly mercury, though, that is the risk?
That's what's been monitored so far. There's concern. There's some data available for things that really live in the ocean, like tuna and swordfish and such. But the data that I'm aware of from Narragansett Bay has primarily been mercury data that's been collected from fish tissue. So there's a collaboration between people involved in the seafood industry, the health department, and our department, our division of agriculture, which is engaged in promoting local seafood, in trying to develop guidance and get it out to people. The health department has, I know in the past, tried to provide information in multiple languages. I would say that would be a great opportunity for more partnership, because the state agencies are limited in how much manpower they have to get the message out, but connecting to more groups. And there is, concern about folks fishing in waters where contamination is likely to be higher.
But I guess it depends on the life cycle of these fish, right? Many of them spend their time out in the ocean, and then like the bluefish and stripers, striped bass that most of the fisher people are going for are ocean going fish, right? So when they come back.
Yeah, I don't have the list in front of me of which ones they've been advised that are considered don't consume them, but I could try to find that on the health department website, but we are concerned that there's data showing there's certain levels of contamination. We get guidance from EPA on how much is acceptable from a human health perspective in fish tissue, and there's guidance about consumption and limiting your exposure, particularly for pregnant women and sensitive individuals. But we're going to have to do some more work. It's difficult in the marine environment because the fish move around. It's not completely understood where they're all breeding necessarily, reproducing. We have, visitors to the bay that, like you just pointed out, spend time offshore. But there's enough evidence now that it's an issue we really need to look into better.
There's a question that you didn't get to, which is about boating access. So I know I'm seeing Dave Everett's on the call, who knows something about a specific project of a kayak launch. But do you have any other big picture stuff on boat access to the river?
Well, I think from a very big picture point of view, the department wants to try to facilitate access to outdoor recreation. The governor had a task force around this, and we are, as a state agency, a major promoter of the facilities for outdoor recreation and boating access. So there are fishing piers and boating access points that the department maintains. I don't think we have any current plans for construction in the Seekonk area, but I wasn't able to research that too extensively before the talk.
Yeah.
I know there are programs, recreational grant programs, where people can apply for funds to help subsidize those kind of projects. It's been pretty competitive. So I am aware of projects being proposed that maybe didn't get selected in this last round for recreational grants, but the department does play a role in trying to facilitate providing access.
Yeah. Dave, I see you're now unmuted. Do you want to give us an update on what's going on?
Well, the best thing I can say is that, yes, we did get a grant we got a rec grant from the state. And it's been a lot of work to get it to the point where we're about to begin construction. I was going to note, I was going to type that because this is a conservation area, it's type 1 waters, the area of the Seekonk that you're most familiar with. There are limitations on what you can do. But having said that, CRMC was very supportive, and we had to meet a lot of criteria. Environmentally and otherwise, with DM and CRMC. So, and by the way, so the schedule is that I would say within the next couple of weeks, construction should begin. I hope you can hear me.
Garbled, but it's okay.
So yeah, there's fabrication ongoing of the mattress of the boat launch. Again, this is just for hand-carried boats. So we're talking about kayaks and, small, boats propelled without motors, basically. And you can't bring a car to the launch. You have to carry it from your car. And most of you know this. So anyway, that is moving along. We've cleared all the hurdles.
So Dave, that's wonderful. I think most people do not know about this, and it's going to be at the bottom of Irving, right where it meets River Road. Is that right?
Yes. Well, just to the north, we actually had 3 different potential sites. We moved it from where it was initially going to be, which was right there, and now that's the site of another project that is also delayed. Which is reconstructing the riverbank, also with the help of a DEM grant. So what I can tell you is it's about, I think it's 120 or so feet north of that intersection. So it's technically on Gulf Avenue. We did get a spot where the water wasn't so low that you had to, you could, as somebody said, you could watch an egret walk hundreds and hundreds of feet out.
Right.
Which would not be a very good place to put a boat in. So we had to pick the in-between spot.
Yeah, I've seen some parts of the river. It's amazing when you're rowing up the channel and they're at a very low tide. You can see egrets sitting on both sides of you, just about 30 feet on each side, standing up. There's more fish questions. So Are there any freshwater fish that live in the area of above the boathouse towards Pawtucket? I mean, it's sort of a question of how saline the water is. All the slides were of saltwater fish. Is there a year-round fishery? Is another part of this question from David Green.
Well, I can just know, I just know that in the same surveys from 2019, which I tallied up, they caught some bluegill, they caught some white perch. You know, there could be some species. The salinity, and that's one of the things the study is evaluating, because that will make a difference to what types of species they can promote habitat for where. You know, it does change with the changes in the river flow in that area, more so than as you go down the bay, it's more stable salinity. I'm not that familiar though with all the details on the species of fish. I can find out.
There may be somebody on here who's the fish maven. I have a question for you, just a very big picture question, and that is, how much of our problems in the river are sort of from way outside this area, and how much of it is that can actually be fixed by things we do right in the immediate area?
I think the pathogen problems are largely within the watershed and local issues that can be tackled with green infrastructure and better practices, and, you know, the wastewater infrastructure improvements that are planned. You know, I think there was a regional Mercury TMDL, because I could point out that where on these, you know, nutrient and pathogen problems where we really are talking about sources that are within the watershed, mercury contamination in Rhode Island waters was in part attributed to really air deposition and sources that go out to the Midwest in terms of power plants and industrial production.
Right.
And so that problem is one that's just really difficult because it's such a persistent contaminant.
Those are coal-fired power plants,
Yeah.
right, that are dumping mercury and other things into our ecosystem.
That has been, you know, there's been controls placed since that TMDL was done quite a few years ago, and it'd be interesting to reevaluate that. But air deposition was considered a major source at the time.
Okay, let's see, there's a bunch of, somebody was asking, what's the red flag notifications when it's on the sewage plants?
So that's, I believe, their current system of warning folks about the potential for conditions being affected by either a release or a potential coming release due to forecast rainfall. And that's really about pathogens, and I believe about pathogens and the you know, potential exposure for people that might be recreating on the river. And that's a system that it's been agreed is going to be, well, there's an agreement between DEM and NBC through their permit to work on a notification system that will be better than that, and have some system. You know, having said that, I would say there's two types of overflows that happen in terms of sort of nomenclature. There's the combined sewer overflows, which are driven by precipitation events. And then there's what's called sewer system overflows, which is usually related to some breakdown or, you know, perturbance in the system. And then you can have problems at the treatment plant itself. But the number of overflows has also been declining over time with better maintenance and a nod to the people that are running the plants. So I think NBC, I was looking at one of their reports, they were reporting dry weather overflows. And from January to June of this year in 2020, they only had one. Whereas
Here on the Seekonk you're talking about?
That's from, I think, their whole system. But you know, back in 2004, there were 31. So, so there, you know, the maintenance and fixing these systems and understanding where they're vulnerable, the infrastructure is going to age and it needs maintenance. And that's a constant, you know, you're never done maintaining these water-based infrastructure systems. And so investing in repairs where you anticipate you're going to have problems, but sometimes you can't anticipate it.
Well, there's so many interesting questions in here. I'm going to try to get some in. I did want to mention that we're going to put this video up somewhere on the Brown YouTube channel. I don't really know how this is going to work. We don't have a link yet, but we will try to send it out to everybody when the video's ready, which these are coming out really quite fast now from Zoom. Here's some interesting things, like Dave Everett saying the tides are very high on the Seekonk and rising during king tides. The water can be close to the road levels. What does this portend for the future, and what are the ramifications?
Yeah, so the whole issue of sea level rise, you know, it's going to have to be evaluated what the impacts would be to some of the infrastructure and roads that are out there. We've sponsored some projects in Newport recently for the installation of tide gates on stormwater discharge locations, because the tides and the elevation of sea level rise was basically backing up the stormwater within those systems to the point that it's creating flooding, where it hadn't a long time ago. And so they've got to block that seawater from coming in. And so this whole idea of adapting to the conditions as they're changing is something that's really important in terms of building some resiliency. So be looking at those things and trying to figure out whether there's opportunities to adapt. Is there space to adjust? And that's where the Municipal Resiliency Program from the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank is really trying to sponsor that thinking at the municipal level, where we're going to need to do some more work on that. The SNEP program that I mentioned has recently given a grant to, I believe it's the town of Warren, and they're going to be looking at, I should make sure I get this right, but they're basically going to be looking at whether things should be relocated in a commercial district because of anticipated persistent flooding impacts, and actually talking of, you know, raising the concept of sort of retreating from where the problem is.
Yeah, very expensive, very expensive. And we've got to be starting to think about it, like as the same with all the sewage treatment and other infrastructure down there. Don Pryor asked this question: Is RIDEM doing some work to develop ways to communicate the economic benefits of improved water quality? The boat club is a good example of where a couple of years ago they were able to host a regional regatta that came because the original site in Delaware had to be abandoned because of algae blooms that covered the river. Conversely, a regatta more recently had rowers being disgusted because of dead fish all around their sculls. So there was a definite opportunity to show how those kind of events generate income for the city and the state. Has anybody done that or communicated it?
So I know that our department, the events that happen at Fort Adams and the Volvo race, sort of international sailing type of events, large scale events that have occurred, there has been some assessment of the economic impacts of those. Right now, we're somewhat constrained in having the expertise to do too much in that regard, but there are established programs that try to quantify the benefit of some of the outdoor recreation that's done through the federal Fish and Wildlife agencies. And I want to point out that the Narragansett Bay program has committed to trying to explore what they're calling sort of social indicators, and certainly some of that might take us into discussions about economic benefits. It's an important point, it's something we try to do within the capacities that we have.
So just a couple of points about fish from people who are on the ball. Wenley Ferguson talks about river herring, including alewife and blueback herring. move upstream to the mouth of the 10-mile river, and then they move upstream up those fish ladders as far as the Main Street Dam. And then Al Dahlberg talks about large predatory fish like tuna, swordfish, stripers, and bluefish that feed on other fish will store up the persistent and bioaccumulative toxics like mercury in their tissue. So if the sediment gets stirred up, it becomes available, right? So the sediment's okay as long as it's down in there. But once it gets stirred up, that's a problem. And when does that tend to happen when it gets stirred up? You know?
So the issues related to sediment contamination have come up when there's been actual like physical projects that have been involving dredging or working in these urban rivers. So this has become an issue in some of the work that we have going on in the Blackstone. In other cases, you're not disturbing it as such that you're getting to the areas that are heavily contaminated, the depths of sediments that are worse off. Mercury has forms that are bioavailable and then other forms that aren't. And so there's a whole sort of cycle of how that works. But the gentleman's correct that it bioaccumulates in fish. And so your top predator fish are gonna typically be, they're gonna accumulate that, and that's gonna be a concern.
Much higher levels.
Yeah.
So Al also asked about, does anyone in Rhode Island track PFOS and PFAS in sediment and or fish? So just so people know, aren't those some sort of flame retardants and stuff like that, or persistent organic chemicals?
Yeah, these are manufactured chemicals that are widespread in the environment. They have been used in flame retardants and also water repellents and your microwave popcorn bags and just all sorts of products. And so the department has been working pretty hard on the issue of these PFAS, PFOA compounds. We are not currently funded to do wide-ranging work. The focus has been on human health and drinking water sources. But we're tracking very closely what's being done nationally on the research in terms of whether these compounds are getting into the natural environment, and where we have hotspots. Like there is the case out in Pascagoula where a fire district had a problem. It may not have been the town of Pascagoula, but a fire district had a problem, and there was sampling of wells around that. If we find a location, I think we will sample the immediate environment around that, including rivers. If we find it in a river, we'll probably then be motivated to potentially look at the fish. It's a really complex question. The methods for just analyzing these compounds are still being worked out. And it's something, we have a whole task force between ourselves and the health department tracking that issue.
Thanks. I wanted to bring in Rick Richards here because he's led a lot of work by the Seekonk River Revitalization Alliance, which is a group of people trying to really deal with the condition of the riverbank and to work together and create alliances and see if we can make exciting projects happen that would improve the quality of the riverbank. So Rick, do you want to talk about that and where, what might be a good outcome, or a way to go forward for the people who are on this call who care about the Seekonk? Well,
there are two things I'd like to mention. One is related to the kayak launch that David talked about. A sort of a partner project there was taking some of the pavement out of Gulf Avenue. So it would become a more porous area, a more park-like area. And it would be a fairly simple thing. You just need to leave enough pavement for a fire truck to get through, but you could reduce a lot of pavement and turn it into a much prettier place, a more park-like area and more ecologically healthy. So that's one thing that I think requires just kind of persistent advocacy. It's one of those projects, it's a great idea, it's not that hard to do, And somehow it just costs a little bit too much money, or it's a little too low on the list. And so just pushing on that would make it happen. The other is more complicated, but it is a really interesting opportunity, I think. The York Pond watershed is about 400 acres that goes up to Moses Brown. And it's an interesting area because it's been split. The water that comes off that watershed is not mixed with sewage. So what you're getting is surface runoff and all the things that Sue is talking about, the pollutants, the particles, come down into York Pond. And if you've looked at York Pond, you can see it's about an inch deep. It is full of toxic particles. And it would be just wonderful to use that area as kind of a green infrastructure demonstration site. There are lots of big streets that have way too much pavement. You can think of Irving Street, which you could land an airplane on and you'd be just fine. Nobody would notice. That could be, you know, you could put a lot of green infrastructure there, and it's an interest, as I say, it's an opportunity. It's also an interesting exercise to think about how you would get neighborhood buy-in, because ultimately it's not just not dumping oil in your driveway, it's softening your driveway, it's softening your yard, it's softening every place that you possibly can. It's capturing water when you can. And a homeowner can do an awful lot to purify and control runoff. So you're down to the nitty gritty. How do you talk to individual people? How do you support individual people who are enthusiastic about runoff and greening their yards so that you could soften 400 acres and make York Pond clean? And that would make a huge difference of the runoff of York Pond into the Seekonk River. It's probably one of the major sources of pollutants in that particular area. So those are two things that would be wonderful to, you know, we know what the limits are. They're not enormous. And we could, with enthusiasm and energy, actually do something in those two areas.
Yeah, let me just mention two things. One is, those are the kind of ideas that fall within our Office of Water Resources, the non-point source pollution program. We have some limited experience in Rhode Island with trying to work across neighborhoods, but we also are plugged into examples from success from other states where they have transformed whole neighborhoods, and some of the strategies that went into convincing people to try it. There's a great case from Minnesota where they had one neighborhood do it and another neighborhood not, and then were able to really graphically represent what the change was between the two, and got everyone else interested, and the rain gardens and such were well received. So I definitely encourage people to contact us, and we can try to help facilitate. We do view it as we're interested in trying to facilitate those projects gaining momentum and getting done. The second thing I should mention is the Department of Office of Water Resources, we maintain something called the Watersheds Listserv. So if groups are not receiving that, they can contact the office and sign up, and there should be a way to do that from our website. All of our notifications about funding opportunities go through that. It's one place that you know you're going to hear if the department's offering funding. And we also use it to promote funding from a lot of other sources, including the SNEP program and EPA grants that are out there, and the Bay Project, which has also been distributing money for the past several years. So
we have some great projects that we would love to have funded along the river. And I do want to say that we've been talking a little more, somewhat more on the east side of Providence side, and that East Providence has its own riverfront development issues that it would be great to talk about. We're running out of time. So I wanted to, well, first of all, Rick, I want to make sure people can find the Seekonk Riverbank Revitalization Alliance. How do they get in contact with you as sort of the hub of the wheel of that effort?
Right. I think email is probably the best by far way to do that. Is there a way to circulate my email to anyone who's
Uh,
interested?
Yeah, and isn't it just Rick Richards at,
Richards@gmail.com.
say it again, Rick?
A Richards
Yeah.
@gmail.com.
Great. So, given how little time we have, I think what we have left to do is mostly to thank Sue Kiernan for an incredibly informative hour and a half with just tons of information about this place. And I think it helps us to really strategize on ways to go forward. So we really owe you our deep gratitude. So thank you so much, Sue.
Happy to do so.
And everybody stay in touch. We'll send out the link to this talk. It'll again be on this Brown YouTube channel. And then if people want your slides, I hope it's okay, Sue, if I share your slides.
Sure.
Given that I already have on my Dropbox site. And I think if you all see that on the Q&A window, there's a link on there, which we'll leave open for a couple more minutes. So if you have that, if not, you can email me. I'm at timmons@brown.edu. So thanks to all of our co-sponsors. Thanks to our organizing group, and thanks to Media Services and to Brown for doing the web hosting, and to the NBC for paying for that amazing help from Media Services. It made all the difference. So thanks everybody, take care, and we'll see you out on the river or by the river. Enjoy the river. Take care.